Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us today for an MP webinar on managing remote employees, how to maintain compliance and optimize productivity. I'm Amy Wieman, Head of Marketing here at MP. And for those of you joining us on a webinar for the first time, MP is a full-service human capital management company, offering a suite of products and services, including HR, payroll, benefits administration, time and attendance, and compliance assistance. We support clients with cutting-edge technical solutions, as well as proactive, reliable service and deep HR and payroll expertise. At MP, we are wired for HR. We help our clients succeed by aligning their HR strategy with their business goals. Your presenters today are two of MP's top HR specialists, Sherry Heller and Amanda Leonardi. Sherry is a senior HR advisor here at MP. She provides HR support to businesses in a wide variety of industries. She consults with business owners and managers at all levels of the organization to develop and implement their HR infrastructure. Sherry has over 20 years experience in training and development, strategic planning, policy development, and employee relations, along with a Master of Education in Instructional Design from UMass Boston. Amanda Leonardi is SHRM certified, an HR generalist here at MP. She currently provides HR support to small, medium, and large-sized businesses across a variety of industries. She previously managed HR for a 250-employee nonprofit organization. Amanda received her BA from Duquesne University in Pittsburgh and received her SHRM certification earlier this year. And Sherry's SHRM certified as well. I just want a couple housekeeping notes. We encourage you to ask questions. The more we can tailor this presentation to your specific needs, the more valuable it will be. So you can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. And also a recording of the webinar will be sent out later today following the presentation, along with the slides. And with that, I'm going to hand the mic off to Sherry.
Thank you, Amy, and good afternoon, everybody. Let's start off with our legal disclaimer. Because this is intended for educational and informational purposes only. We will be talking a lot about employment law, especially during this presentation. And while we hope you learn a lot today, we want to make sure that none of it is construed as legal advice. And that brings us to our presentation topics. So we'll start talking about remote work trends for 2021, a little bit about the pros and cons of remote work, and then compliance and HR considerations. And then Amanda will start focusing more on the telework policies and challenges with managing remote employees. So before we actually even get into the presentation, I want to talk about sort of defining terms, because a lot of times we use terms like remote work and telecommuting, and they're interchangeably, but there are differences between the two. Remote work suggests that the employee is just that, remotely located, while telecommuting, also called telework, can mean that the employee might be working on site some of the time, such as the hybrid environments many companies have been employing as their employees are coming back to the office as COVID restrictions are lifted and vaccines are more widely available. So whether your employees are working from a remote location or telecommuting a portion of their work week, there are a lot of considerations for employers. So, and as the country is emerging from the COVID-19 pandemic, we're getting back to business, let's look at some of the trends. So doing the research on this was really, really interesting. There was a recent Gallup poll that showed that more than 50% of all full-time employees are working from home at least some of the time. In some white-collar occupations, more than 80% are working from home. So when those working from home were asked about their preferred work arrangement once COVID restrictions are lifted and employers give them the choice, 35% surveyed said that they will continue to work from home, while only 17% said that they would choose to return to the office. 4 in 10 white-collar workers prefer remote work. So all signs are really pointing to a growing number of hybrid teams as we emerge from the pandemic and get back to that quote-unquote new normal. There was another survey done by the accounting firm PricewaterhouseCoopers, and they had some really interesting findings on there. First, remote work has been an overwhelming success for both employees and employers. Like yourselves, us at MP, we just kind of jumped into it last year ago, March. went home on a Friday and found out we weren't coming back for almost a year. So it has been really crazy. A lot of companies had to pivot. Some were prepared, some weren't. But overall, it really has, for most companies, been successful. And the other finding is that the office is really here to stay, but its role is set to change. So less than 1 in 5 executives say they want to return to the office as it was pre-pandemic. The rest are really grappling with how widely to extend remote work options, with just 13% of the executives prepared to let go of the office for good. Meanwhile, 87% of the employees say the office is important for collaborating with team members and building relationships, their top rated needs for the office. So it really is, it's not going to go away, but it's definitely going to change. Employees want to return to the office more slowly than employers expect. But July 2021, 75% of executives anticipate that at least half of the office employees will be working in the office. But in comparison, 61% of employees expect to spend half their time in the office by July. So there's a little bit of a disconnect there. And I think employers really need to pay attention to how their employees are transitioning and how comfortable they are with that. The other finding is that there is really no consensus on the optimal balance of workdays at home versus in the office. So over half of employees would prefer to be remote at least 3 days a week once pandemic concerns recede. While most executives expect options for remote work, they are also worried about the effect. 68% of them say that typical employees should be in the office at least 3 days a week to maintain a distinct company culture. And then finally, least experienced workers really are the ones that are most in need of the office. So respondents with the least amount of professional experience are more likely to want to be in the office more often. Just on our own team, our HR team here at MassPay, 25% of our team joined during the pandemic. So we actually did not have a chance to actually meet in person until just a few weeks ago. So it's been a really interesting environment. One of the things I think we've noticed a lot is that all that learning you do through osmosis when you're in and amongst other people, that's the piece that's missing, and especially for the least experienced workers. They're more likely to value meeting with managers or company training programs than their more experienced colleagues. And then this article was fascinating. Inc. magazine put out an article in April as more companies plan to reopen their offices, that the hybrid workplace model looks likely to be a popular option. So in a hybrid model, an employer would offer a mix of working at home and in the office. Nearly half of the employees say in this study that was done by Envoy, which is a maker of workplace safety tools, including room booking platforms and sign-in systems. If you've been in our MP office, you've actually used Envoy. But nearly half of the people say that they want flexibility to spend some of the work week in the office and some of it working from home. What's more, nearly half of those surveyed respondents say they would likely look for another job if their employer does not offer a hybrid workplace. So all these surveys are really just indicating that companies really need to take remote and telework options into consideration. So we're going to be using those terms interchangeably a lot, remote and telework, and we're going to try and differentiate where it's important. So first, let's look at the pros and cons of remote work for both the employer and the employee. Oh, excuse me. So some of these you'll see repeated as benefits for remote work for employer and employee. A lot of employers did find that it's a lot more increased productivity for people working remotely, and a lot of employees found that they are being more productive. There's not as many people showing up at your doorstep or interrupting you during the workday. Reduced expenses were also a really big bonus. So for employers, that could mean just office space, that could mean operational expenses, travel expenses, things like that. For employees, those reduced expenses are obviously, not commuting. For some people, maybe pants, makeup. I mean, it's amazing, not going out to lunch all the time. There's so many pluses and reduced expenses to working from home. For employers, expanding the applicant pool is a really big plus, because if you're able to offer that hybrid environment or hire people who are out of state and can work remotely, you're just expanding your talent pool. The other thing it has done for employers in a lot of respects is it has increased collaboration. We've been able to very effectively use our collaboration tools on our HR team so that we don't really feel like we've missed a beat from a collaborative standpoint, which has been wonderful. It does reduce absences for the employer because a lot of times people who maybe didn't feel well enough to come into the office or maybe just needed to be able to take some time off to run to a doctor's appointment or do something like that are able to work around that when they're in a work from home environment. And for both employers and employees, there are a lot of people who are concerned about their carbon footprint. And honestly, if we are not taking up so much space in offices and using all of the utilities and the travel and everything else associated with it, we're reducing our carbon footprint. And then employers are also finding a lot more increased satisfaction, employee satisfaction by being able to work from home. On the employee side, a lot of people are finding fewer distractions, although I know that Amanda's, I think, going to talk a little bit about Zoom fatigue. That's gotten to be a little bit of an issue. A lot of employees are finding a better work-life balance, being able to get things done that they weren't able to do before, which is making them feel more effective at work. Improve technical skills. I will tell you that a little over a year ago, Amanda and I did a webinar, our last webinar from the office, and we were so reliant on our marketing team to help us just maneuver through Zoom, and our skills have grown exponentially over this last year. And then the other thing that has been a benefit for employees is it gives them a lot more job opportunities. If you think about it, before, somebody who was working remotely, say maybe one of our employees, we have employees now in 17 states, somebody who's working out of Alabama before may not have had the same job opportunities because we weren't typically a remote environment. But now that all of us have been able to work remote this past year, we're finding that we really can offer people a lot more opportunities. So there's definitely a lot of pluses on the benefits of remote work or teleworking. But there are also a number of challenges to remote work or hybrid work environments. On the employer side, home office costs, and Amanda's going to touch on this a little bit more later on in the presentation, but figuring out how to give your employees what they need to function well at home, whether it's buying new equipment, licenses to things like Zoom or other collaborative software. Company culture can be suffering to some extent because oftentimes that company culture is happening in the workplace. So it's just maybe something that employers now have to start shifting how they think about company culture. Finding the right people can be a challenge for employers in a remote work environment because not everybody is suited to be a remote worker. Then there's also the confidentiality and security risks that just go along with doing anything online. And then connectivity issues, which I'm sure you've all found throughout this past year that, right in the middle of a presentation, the Wi-Fi goes out or, all sorts of crazy things have happened. On the employee side, some of the challenges are that out of sight, out of mind, especially for those of you who have more hybrid environments where some people are choosing to work more from home, some are choosing to work more in the office. Sometimes you've got to make sure that as an employee, you get seen when you're working remotely, and that can be a challenge. For some people, that increased isolation has been challenging, and then also unplugging from work. It is really hard to figure out when work ends and when home begins. I know for myself, the beginning of this pandemic, I hadn't set up a proper office, so I was doing everything from the kitchen. So I would literally go from one kitchen counter to the other kitchen counter. It didn't even feel like I was unplugging from work. Now I've got it set up so that I actually have an office, and it has made a whole world of difference in figuring out how to unplug from work. For some employees, they have found some decreased productivity. I don't think that's an overall trend, but it does happen with some people because their situations at home may not be conducive to being able to be productive. And there's been a lot more scheduling of calls and meetings and things that have also interrupted productivity. And then finally, all those distractions from home, the doorbell ringing, the construction outside, the dog barking, the kids in the background, a lot of those have been a challenge that a lot of employers are trying to figure out how to maneuver through. So next topic is talking about compliance and HR considerations. So this gets really technical. So I want to this is where I want to differentiate a little bit between that remote work environment, which is really somebody who lives in another state and does not travel to the office, versus what I'm going to refer to as telework or telecommuting, which is somebody who is able to do sort of a hybrid kind of thing. So the first compliance consideration is really exempt versus non-exempt employees. So under the Fair Labor Standards Act, non-exempt employees do have to track hours worked, and they have to be paid overtime for hours worked over 40 in a work week. But not only that, there's also state and local labor laws to be considered. Tracking hours gets very, very tricky. In recording working time under the FLSA, there's something referred to as de minimis work. And so it's really important for employers to understand what time worked is considered compensable, what you have to track and pay for. So in recording working time under FLSA, infrequent and insignificant periods of time beyond scheduled working hours, which cannot, as a practical matter, be precisely recorded for payroll purposes, can be disregarded. The courts have held that such periods of time are de minimis or insignificant. So what that means is that if you have a non-exempt employee who takes a few minutes at the beginning of the day, or at the end of the day, to just catch up on a few emails. Maybe they're just reading through emails. Maybe many of you probably do this. I kind of just like to clear out any of the emails I don't have to deal with, just kind of do a little house cleaning so that I can start fresh in the morning. Those things might be considered de minimis or just insignificant time and not have to be tracked. But if your managers are emailing your employees off hours and expecting to be responded to, and the employees are responding, or they're responding to your customers or clients, that time may need to be tracked. So it's really important for you to pay attention to how your non-exempt employees are working. So, and then in addition to state and local taxes, the labor and employment laws of the states where a remote employee is working may apply to the employment relationship. So what I mean by that is taking into consideration things like posting requirements, meal breaks, overtime requirements. So for example, in California, overtime is anything over 8 hours in a work day, not 40 hours in a work week. So different states have different rules. So many states have put into place paid family or sick leave options. And then there's still a lot of the COVID relief time, emergency sick time that a lot of states are doing individually. So it is so important to make sure that if you have employees, so here's where we have to differentiate between that remote worker and that hybrid worker. So I'm going to use those of us here in New England as an example, because during the pandemic, a lot of us who were maybe based in Massachusetts, but maybe lived in Rhode Island, New Hampshire, or Maine, were choosing to do or having to do a lot of work from home. And now we're sort of returning to the office in that hybrid environment. So it's going to be important to differentiate where your work location is. So in that hybrid environment, your work location may be the office, which means that you would comply with your state policies or laws that apply to the state in which your office is in. But if you have a truly remote employee, like we have employees in various states here at MassPay, those employees we may have to comply with the labor laws in those states, because those employees are not going to be covered, say, under PFML, for example, here in Massachusetts. So there's really a lot of things to take into consideration. So first and foremost is figuring out where the employee's true work location is. If they live in Alabama and you're based in Massachusetts, I'm telling you, more than likely their work location should be Alabama. But again, this is a conversation you need to have with your accountant, your HR professional, maybe your payroll specialist, but it's really important to differentiate. If you have somebody working hybrid, those individuals before were doing it as an option. During the pandemic, we had to do it as a requirement. Now we might be heading back to doing it as an option. So all of that is going to determine where their work location is going to be, and that's going to determine which state employment laws that you need to follow. And then for employees wanting to work out of state, either all of the time or period of the time, there's potential tax and payroll issues for both the employer and the employee. And unfortunately, there isn't a one-size-fits-all answer. It's really going to depend on the state the individual is performing work in, how long they are there, and a host of other factors. So when an employee is working outside of the state where the employer operates, the employer may be responsible for the other state's taxes, including income taxes. Each state's income tax and withholding requirements vary significantly and may be based on both personal residence and or work location. So for example, you may, if your business is in Massachusetts, your employee lives in New Hampshire, where New Hampshire doesn't have state income tax, but Massachusetts does. If your work location is Massachusetts and the employee's work location is Massachusetts, even if they're working hybrid, they may still have to pay Massachusetts taxes. So there's a lot of variations, and it's very complicated because states have differing thresholds for an individual working remotely in that state that trigger the tax implications. So for example, in Illinois, it's 30 days. In New York, it's 14 days. There's just so many considerations. So there isn't a one size fits all, and you're really going to have to really pay attention to, now that we're moving out of that mandatory remote environment into a more hybrid environment, where your employees should be located. Excuse me. And I really encourage you to look at that sooner rather than later, because I'll tell you, once end of year hits and all of a sudden your employees go to do their taxes and they're realizing that they're being taxed in one state but live in another, then you're going to be incurring time and expense with amended returns and a lot of other things that are just going to be very, very time consuming. So this is the time to take a look at that. COVID-related remote work has dramatically impacted this area of the law, and it has exponentially increased the number of employees working in different states than where the employer is located, excuse me, or where they reside, and many states have been slow to adjust to this. However, several states have implemented COVID-19 rules regarding tax implications for remote workers. So again, this is a state-by-state analysis that needs to be done by the employer for each employee wishing to work remotely out of state. And then finally, employers should also be aware of state laws regarding workers' compensation and unemployment insurance. Employers usually have to obtain workers' comp insurance in the state where the employee is actually working. It may be the case that the employee's compensation, it might be the case that the workers' compensation laws in the employer's state would not apply to the employee working remotely in another state. The same also applies to unemployment insurance, where the out-of-state employee would likely trigger the state's requirement that the employer register for and pay unemployment insurance premiums through that state's particular unemployment program. So what happens is that if you have to let somebody go or lay somebody off, and they are living out of state, and you have been continuing to consider them a worker working out of your office, but they have not been working out of your office, they're going to file for unemployment in the state in which they live. That's going to send up a red flag. And a lot of states have reporting requirements between agencies. So it's very important to get that all squared away ahead of time, because you don't want to be caught finding out that you should have been paying into the state unemployment system in a state that you weren't. And again, that involves amended returns, sometimes going to be late filing fees. So there's a lot of considerations on top of the compliance issues. All right, and let's look at some of the HR considerations as well. So I talked a little bit about company culture, but figuring out company culture is really, really challenging. We started out as a small, very local type of payroll company. And as we've grown over the last almost 20 years, our culture has really kind of stayed intact. And then come the pandemic, and we really went to such a remote environment, and we've hired so many people in so many different states that we, like so many employers, we're navigating how to really infuse our company culture to people who aren't physically in the office. The other issues are things like onboarding. Who's doing your new hire paperwork? I-9 compliance. That's still in flux as COVID restrictions are being lifted. And the state of emergency is soon to be lifted at the federal level as well as state level. So that's going to be something to keep an eye on. Training has been a real issue for a lot of employers that used to do training on site for new hires or for ongoing training, and figuring out how to employ that for your remote workers as well. Employment posters. So even though somebody might be working out of their home in Alabama, As an employer, if that is considered their work state, you have to post those employment posters. So staying abreast of that is really challenging, and how to facilitate that. Performance management is really, and I think Amanda's going to talk a little bit about this, as far as really just the way managers have to kind of look at things a little differently and how they're managing performance. Before, I used to be able to say, hey, if I can see you working, you must be working. But now if I can't see you working, are you really working, and how do I know that? So these are some of the challenges that you need to take into consideration. Policies and procedures, so many changes. A lot of us, again, went remote really forced to go remote, but we didn't have policies in place for what our expectations were. And again, Amanda's going to delve into that coming up. Just the remote environment in general and how that's impacting your employees. I have to say that I think that our conversations with employers over the last, probably the last month or so, have really been focused on doing a lot of surveys and making sure that employees feel heard, and that you're really understanding what they're looking for as far as that remote environment. Excuse me, I already touched on the non-exempt employee issue, but I can't be overstated how important it is to make sure that just because you're in a remote environment doesn't mean that you don't have to comply with all of the Fair Labor Standards Act and any state and local laws regarding non-exempt employees. Workers' comp coverage, you need to take a look and see how that might have changed. You should be contacting your brokers. One neat thing is that it might actually lower your costs in some respects. You might have people who used to be on the road selling, and now you're realizing that they can sell via Zoom almost as effectively. That can actually lower your workers' comp rates. Office closings. Office closings are really, really challenging up here in New England, where we're prone to blizzards in the winter, but now you have remote employees who are in different parts of the country. How is that impacting them if the office is closed? So those are the kind of things to take into consideration. The leave laws I mentioned earlier, absolutely. They are coming out fast and furious. At any point that we don't have a lot happening at the federal level, more is going to happen at the state level. And when that happens, we end up with 50 different types of laws. We're in 50 different countries sometimes. So it's going to be very, very important to make sure you're up to date on what all those leave laws look like for those states. And then again, identifying which ones you have to comply with based on where your employees are working. And then finally, discriminatory practices. It can be very, very easy to kind of lose sight of making sure that you are taking everything into consideration when you are allowing certain people to work remote, but others not, or just any of your disciplinary practices, any of that. Really important to make sure you're implementing everything in a non-discriminatory manner. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Amanda to talk about telework policies.
All right, thank you, Sherry, and hi everyone. Hope you're all doing well on this sunny Thursday. I'm going to dive into an important topic of establishing a telework policy, and what items you should consider as you're crafting one up. And the first step here, going to blow your mind, but in creating a remote work or telecommuting policy, it's to decide who can work from home. So when you're deciding who can work from home, it's important to know that you may offer different benefits or terms of employment to different groups of employees. But as Sherry mentioned, the distinction has to be based on non-discriminatory criteria. So for instance, a telecommuting option or a requirement can be based on, the type of work performed, or an employee classification, so exempt employees versus non-exempt employees, or even location of the office or employee. But you should be able to support the business justification for allowing or requiring certain groups to telecommute in order to back these decisions up, and justify the delineation isn't based upon any type of discriminatory factors. All right. So developing your telecommuting or telework policy should start with three main components. First is updated job descriptions. Second is creating a comprehensive telework policy. And third is constructing a telework agreement to have employees sign off on. If you take time to establish, strong descriptions, policies, and agreements, your ability to effectively manage and hold employees who are teleworking and working remotely accountable is going to be backed up by strong documentation. So if you're in the situation where you are, converting one of your pre-pandemic in-office positions into a completely remote or telework position, the job description that the employee had before will likely not be the same. So you really need to take a look at that job description, determine what essential duties may be subject to change, and update those accordingly. Then you want a strong telework policy, which we'll walk through some suggestions on how to craft that up in a moment. And then again, last but not least, a telework agreement to establish the terms and conditions surrounding the telework that you should have employees again sign off on. So although some employers will be, comfortable or have been comfortable up until this point over the past year, sending everyone home with their laptop, saying, go forth and be productive. Most will want to be a little bit more specific. And now that this is, employers are making the decision to keep these types of arrangements in place long term, past the pandemic, it's really important to put a little bit more framework around it. So a good telecommuting policy will generally address employee eligibility for remote work, first and foremost, including the process for, submitting requests to work from home, productivity standards, security expectations, hours of work, office expenses, and even alcohol and drug use. So for instance, your policy might require that employees are available by phone, or, messaging app, email during their regular in-office hours. It may require that they meet all deadlines and maintain client contacts per usual. Check in with their manager at the close of each workday to report what they have accomplished. So policies may outline things like that. And then you want to also be sure to let employees know whom to contact if they run into any technical difficulties at home, which I'm sure most of us, if not all of us on this call have experienced over the past year of working from home.
We've
So
had a couple of doozies, huh?
we have, but you know what? It keeps us on our toes and never a dull moment. So
It does,
you
right?
got to keep it fresh. So all of these areas on your screen here are items that you should take into consideration when drafting up your policies to set the stage, and lay your expectations out there explicitly for employees. So speaking of setting expectations, excuse me, um, my goodness, I'm sorry. Um, Employers should have clear guidelines and policies, regarding what's expected of the employee in terms of hours, availability, and work product. So some general areas to consider here include detailing, their normal work duties and responsibilities, making clear the hours of work the employee is expected to put in, along with strict adherence to any timekeeping policies, setting the hours of availability to communicate, regarding company business and job duties. So, when are they expected to be available if something comes up? Determining how to handle communication of work assignments and personal needs, including reporting absences due to, injury or illness, or caring for a family member. Discussing the use of company equipment and materials, ensuring the employee, protects company information by following company's policies and practices regarding information security and data protection. So you want to, ensure that unauthorized individuals don't, have access to company data, whether it be in print or electronically. um, you want to also include in there in those expectations to, maintain a safe environment in the employee's workspace. So long story short, if you, want your employees to fully settle into remote work productively, and also be able to hold employees accountable effectively, you really do have to set these clear expectations and ensure that employees are aware of these standards. So that all should be outlined in your policies and agreements. Okay, so as Sherry alluded to earlier, covering work from home expenses has become a pretty big concern since the pandemic, and because of the fact that the nature of what we've been through for the past year has pushed so many employers into remote work and so many employees into remote work. So while federal law does not require employers to pay for work-related expenses incurred by employees when they're working from home, many state laws do. So these state laws often require reimbursement for necessary job expenses for things like internet access, cell phone use, office supplies and equipment, things like printers, ink, that sort of thing. Um, so the only time that the FLSA impacts work from home reimbursements is if the cost would lower the employee's earnings beneath the applicable minimum wage. And because this only protects workers whose income is, relatively close to the minimum wage line, the FLSA is rarely implicated in reimbursements for work-related expenses. Something to keep in mind, though. But remember that this is just on the federal level. Several, like I said, several states have statutes that detail when an employer has to reimburse an employee for business expenses, including those related to working remotely and telecommuting. And so you can see on your screen here the states that have these types of statutes in place. So California, DC, Illinois, Iowa, Massachusetts, Minnesota, Montana, New Hampshire, New York, Pennsylvania. So if you operate in one of these states, or if you have employees who work remotely from those states, be sure to go check into the corresponding state law and ensure you're in compliance.
You know what, Amanda? One thing I just realized that we didn't include, and I think it's a good thing to mention in here, is making sure you've got some good documentation about people working from home. Because if you're giving the employee the option to work partially from home or fully from home, it's not being a requirement that might differentiate whether you're going to need to cover some of these expenses, depending again on those state laws. So it's going to be very important to make sure that you're documenting, when the advantage to working from home is at the employee's request versus the employer's request. So that's just a little piece that I just realized I sort of missed out on this one.
Yeah, no, great point. Thank you for adding that in there. So again, some states require any business related expenses to be reimbursed by employers. And as far as the extent of these expenses, that's really going to be dependent on the employee's job duties. And but when we're thinking about business related expenses, they frequently include things like phone use for business activities, home internet use, postage, online subscription, so like a paid plan for Zoom, printing supplies, ink cartridges, paper, office supplies. Maybe that includes an ergonomic desk and chair, and as well as a work computer. So a written policy, and to kind of piggyback off what Sherry was saying about documentation, but a written policy outlining expense reimbursement for telecommuting arrangements is recommended. Employers with employees working from multiple states, so if you have a workforce that's spread out across the country, you may want to choose to tailor a different policy for each state, or incorporate the most generous requirements into a single policy applicable to all employees, and try to streamline that a little bit. All right, so now that we have gone through some of the prep work necessary to kind of set the stage for remote work, how do you actually manage remote workers when they're actively in the job? So as Sherry mentioned earlier, you really will likely need to take a different approach to managing remote workers than you would when managing employees in person in the office. So the first thing we wanted to kind of touch upon here briefly is technology. So Since so many employers' hands were abruptly forced into allowing for remote work due to the pandemic, many companies just kind of made do with what they had, worked with what they had. However, now that so many employers are working within more of a hybrid model or a fully remote model, it's time to start thinking about making investments in technology to help you manage your workforce as well as help your remote employees succeed. So, some technology to consider, first, time and attendance software. So, this is especially important from a non exempt employee who's working remotely. So, making sure that non exempt employees are tracking their time and in turn being compensated appropriately for all hours worked. Then we have communication and collaboration tools. So, web and video conferencing, instant messaging, group chats, notification apps, things like that. So, really ways for your team to stay connected, to converse, to catch up with one another, ask questions, and my personal favorite, have some laughs together. Um, and one thing that Sherry and I were actually talking about when we were going through this earlier is how helpful seeing someone's status on Microsoft Teams can be. So that's what we use internally at NP. And as you can imagine, there are many times when we on our HR team get a call from a client about a tricky employee situation, or we'll be reading through legislation, trying to make heads or tails of it, and want to make sure that our interpretation of the different language that they speak is correct, and needing to bounce things off of a teammate quickly. So seeing someone's status as available in that little green bubble in Teams helps us know that, hey, this team member is available right now. I'm not going to be bothering them in the middle of a client meeting. So let me reach out and pick their brain on these things. So it's a really helpful tool to stay connected and help collaboration, and also help employees not feel so isolated out there, and know that they have support as they navigate the day to day. Then you probably want to take a look at some tools to measure and manage your productivity, to ensure performance standards and metrics are being met, as well as project management and of course, employee engagement tools. So, a little bit of a shameless plug here. I happen to know of a little company called MP that can help you with many of these solutions. So, specifically time and attendance and employee engagement software. So, don't hesitate to reach out if you'd like to learn more about our solutions in those areas. All right, so we thought this was pretty interesting and spot on when it comes to measuring productivity. So, again, performance measurement tools haven't changed, but where employees are completing, their work has changed. So, traditional measurements for productivity are no longer, the most effective in certain jobs or roles. So, you kind of have to be limber and, like Sherry said, pivot a little bit. So Gallup has identified three universal domains to measure hybrid and remote team productivity, and they did a extensive qualitative analysis and discovered that there were three performance domains that really comprehensively describe and consistently predict success in a role. So the first is setting goals and meeting them, which equates to my work. Partnering for effectiveness, which is my team, and translating work into its consequences, excuse me, which is my customer. And these three core performance domains, my work, my team, my customer, are the standard framework that every leader can really use to evaluate employee productivity, regardless of an employee's location. So, in order to really harness these domains, leaders should really turn their attention to the role that honestly has the most influence on a team, as far as engagement and productivity, which is the manager. And if Sherry, you don't mind going to the next slide here.
It should be measuring
Perfect.
productivity.
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
So managers, like we said, can promote excellence and build a foundation to reliably track employee productivity by completing two main tasks. The first is establishing clear expectations, and the second is setting clear goals. So while these two tasks sound relatively simple, recent Gallup data has shown kind of a different story and painted a different picture, which is managers are actually struggling to accomplish them. So managers should really prioritize ongoing performance conversations more now than ever, as employees, may either be remote permanently or a mixture of both in the office and remote. In addition, managers should engage in collective, goal setting, which boosts employees' intrinsic motivation because, they're active participants in setting and establishing those goals. And then lastly, managers should assess performance goals periodically to make sure they're still relevant and appropriate for these particular roles. So, managing remote and hybrid workers does really require thoughtful adaptations of day-to-day tasks. So, we wanted to provide you with a few suggestions to try out. The first is increasing the frequency of check-in conversations with remote and hybrid workers. This really helps managers, stay on top of their progress and get an active pulse on potential roadblocks while also helping the workers feel supported and connected. The second is be available. So, make sure remote and hybrid workers have easy access to get their questions answered, clarify next steps, and discuss potential obstacles when they can't, under normal circumstances or in the office, stop by your office or, flag you down in the hallway and say, hey, can I ask you a quick question? So, one thing that may be helpful is to establish office hours on your calendar, or, set a status update on your, internal software system that lets people know that you're available. So again, as I mentioned, we use Teams, and if we have a question that we need to ask, our boss, Paul, seeing that little green bubble is a relief, and we know we can shoot him a note or give him a call without disturbing him in the middle of, another meeting. Um, I can't stress this enough. Don't neglect your relationships. So, you know, it's been hard, but it's really important. You want to build in time for small talk during, your check-ins and team meetings, or even outside of those forums. I think in the land of Zoom, it's so easy to, book yourself back to back to back to back Zoom meetings. Um, and not account for time for yourself and your coworkers, and just to have those nice casual check-ins with people, that can make a world of difference. So not neglecting relationships, and scheduling out time and making a conscious effort to address your work relationships can really make up for missing out on those casual conversations, around in the kitchen or around the water cooler that you would have in the workplace. So we all know it's really important to maintain rapport with your team and help employees feel like, they're cared about as people, no matter where they are. And then last but not least, think equity at every turn. So if you manage a hybrid or blended team, um, be very careful and watchful for differences in, the employee experience between employees who are on site versus remote. So, you know ask yourself these questions: does everyone have equal access to opportunities? Do they have an equal say in decisions? Like, are you just going to the in-house employees to ask a question and get their feedback, um, when it comes to your decision making, or are you asking for that feedback from, the team as a whole, including your remote workforce? So noticing and addressing any disparities early is really key, in avoiding tensions and long-term consequences that can arise from favoring employees based upon, their work arrangement. So make sure you're giving everyone the resources, and support that they need to succeed, no matter, where they start in the process. So if you make an effort in these areas on a daily or, weekly basis, it will really make a difference in the ability for you and your team to succeed, in a remote environment. So I do encourage you all to try them out. All right. So, last but not least, and my favorite topic of them all, engagement and culture. This is an area that I think gets lost in a remote environment a little bit. And we at MP have been working, totally remotely since last March, as Sherry mentioned. But we've recently begun phasing departments back into the office. So I've been back into the office a handful of times over the past few weeks, and I can't tell you how much I've missed the company culture and the energy in a room when working with my teammates. And it totally like invigorated me. I came home from my first in office day, and was just, on cloud nine. And it felt really good to just be in a room with people, and have that ability to check in and catch up with them, which
Well, full disclosure, though, that first day we got very little done
this is true. This is
because we had so
true.
much catching up to do.
Exactly, exactly. You know what? It's hard when you really like your teammates.
It's really tough. Very, very tough.
um, but yeah, no, it totally jazzed me up, and it honestly wasn't something that I even realized I was missing over the past year because we on our HR team, Sherry, have done such a good job about staying connected. I mean, honestly, we probably have talked more over the past year and have had more ongoing meetings with one another than we did pre-pandemic. So we've done a really good job at, collaborating. Um, but there's just, there's something about the company culture and being in the office and connecting with teammates and other departments that, I wouldn't necessarily work super closely with each day, or being able to chat one-on-one with our founder and CEO in the kitchen, or being able to eat lunch together. Things like that are oftentimes missing from a remote environment, but I think it's important to try to find ways to replicate that where you can, and fill in the gaps, because it does make a difference. And the social aspect of work is incredibly important for a lot of people. So some ways you can try to tap into your engagement and culture in a remote environment on your screen here. So creating online biographies with professional background, family, hobbies. So creating a space for remote teammates to get to know each other and connect on personal levels, and just learn more about one another. A team member spotlight, so highlighting team members so that everyone can understand, what this person does, and all that they're accomplishing behind the scenes. Weekly check-ins. Every Monday, our boss Paul meets with each of us on our HR team one-on-one, and I know that during that time I have space to ask questions, get support, just catch up with Paul, fill him in on what's going on in my life and things like that. And I know we all on our team, really appreciate and cherish that time with him. Virtual team meetings. So be careful of the overload and the Zoom fatigue that this could potentially, add to. But setting up virtual team meetings for everyone to see each other's faces and remain connected, is a good idea and important. So if you're operating in a hybrid model and have some folks in the office and others working remotely, be sure that if and when you have, on-site meetings in the office, create a way for remote teammates to be there, even if it's virtually, and really feel a part of it. So make sure you're including them in those types of conversations and meetings as well. Add pictures to org charts, really helps put faces to names for folks. I know this is incredibly important, especially for new hires, but even existing employees. As I mean, we've done a lot of growing over the past year, and there's a lot of people who I haven't officially met in person yet, but having a picture so that when I do meet them in person and can go up to them, introduce myself, I know who I'm speaking with, and again, it just helps put faces to names and creates a more human experience that way. Um, Provide increased visibility. Onboarding program. So onboarding an employee remotely is an incredible challenge. So be sure that you are attentive to that process and create space for new employees to shadow and get to know their team and job. As Sherry said earlier, we've hired 25% of our HR team over the past year while working remotely. And one of the things that I think about often and was the most helpful for me personally during my onboarding process at MP, we were in the office at the time, but was just observing and listening in on my teammates on their client calls, or watching them respond to emails, or going to client visits with them to see how they handle different situations. Or even just hearing the team, ask each other questions in the office and hearing those responses. It's not easy to do that remotely and provide that type of shadowing to new hires. So you really do have to figure out ways to create space and give new hires opportunities to observe their teammates. You can also create team goals, establish the camaraderie that way, provide opportunities to collaborate, assign a mentor. So link employees up with senior member of a team, and someone who can coach them and help them succeed. You can, set up monthly meetings just to check in and create space for, conversation and growth. And this is really a great engagement tactic, and helps employees feel like you are investing in them and taking the time to really, take them to the next level and integrate them into the organization. And then provide benefits. So don't forget about the remote workers when it comes to catered lunches or gym memberships or company outings. Be sure that those types of small gestures, and benefits are inclusive of the remote workers as well, so that they feel, integrated into the company culture. So maybe every so often you send them a Grubhub gift certificate, or making sure that the gym membership that you offer is, a national gym membership, or you're finding an alternative solution for them, in their respective workplace or residence. So those items right there are just some ways that you can really tap into your engagement and culture, both on site and remotely. And one thing that I do want to just stress, and I think it's really important right now, is in this current job market, you really have to tap into the employee experience and ensure that it's a positive one, because the world is a candidate's oyster right now when it comes to job seeking. There are so many open jobs, and people are definitely poaching out there to fill their roles. So if you don't invest in and engage your employees, especially in a remote environment, that I think we've all experienced can sometimes feel isolating. You risk losing your top talent. So engagement and culture may seem minor in the grand scheme of things. However, it will ultimately define your success, operating long term in a remote capacity.
All right. So we did get
Alrighty.
one quick question in before we sign off, because we're coming up the end of the hour. It was a very good question from Jessica, saying, are office expense reimbursements for teleworkers the same for remote workers? And some of that is going to depend on what states your remote workers are, and in what states you operate. And then also it's also going to be dependent on whether it's an option for them to work or a requirement for them to work remotely. So there's factors in there that if you want to reach out to us, Jessica, if it's a specific situation, be happy to consult with you on that. And I think that was all the questions we got in. So I guess we'll throw it back to Amy.
Thanks, guys. What a great presentation. We hope you all came away with some helpful information and best practices on managing your remote teams. We have a great program lined up for next week as well. Our Return to Work series continues with a presentation from renowned employment law firm Jackson Lewis. So same time, same place. And I want to remind everyone that a link will be sent out later this afternoon to the recording as well as the entire presentation. And if you have any further questions, please send them to marketing@mp-hr.com, and have a great day. Thanks, everyone.